Welcome to Dear Sandy. I'm Sandy Galiff, a member of the New York State Assembly, and I represent parts of Westchester County and parts of Putnam County. And today we're going to be talking about a wonderful, wonderful organization that does great work in the Westchester County area, but kind of works itself into different areas too, because we don't always have these boundaries. But the Westchester Land Trust has been providing wonderful services to all of us for quite some time, and the president of Westchester Land Trust is with me today, Lori Enzinger, and it's great to have you here, Lori.
Thank you for having me.
And the Westchester Land Trust was started how many years ago? What year?
We are actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. So we were founded in 1988 by really a grassroots group of individuals in the northeastern portion of the county, in the Bedford area. And these individuals were concerned about the increasing threat to their natural resources that was coming from unsustainable development trends. So as you know, Sandy, northern Westchester is home to, for example, the drinking water supply for much of New York City and much of Westchester County. So it was incumbent upon us when we were created to recognize what these conservation priorities needed to be. And we hold out great thanks to those founding fathers and mothers of 30 years ago, and to Louis McCagg, our founder. And he placed the very first conservation easement on his own property back in 1990.
I always say to people, you know, if you start to use the land, if you don't preserve it and you use it, you just never seem to get it back. It's really hard if it gets developed. You don't see too many times where something goes back into an environmentally preserved piece of property. There are probably some examples, but not a lot.
That's right, and we can talk about one of those examples later on if you wish. We call them de-development projects, but they're very, very expensive. So the way that a nonprofit organization like Westchester Land Trust can be most impactful with the limited dollars that we have is to acquire land or conservation easements before the property is developed, before it has an increased value from its developability. And that's what we've done historically. We are completely privately funded for our annual operations. We are reliant heavily on private foundations and individual donors. We don't receive any governmental support for our annual operations at all.
So you have to, so a land trust, let's do a definition of a land trust, because there are land trusts. There's one in the Hudson Highlands, in Putnam County, that I work with on different issues, and throughout the state there are land trusts.
That's right.
So can you give us a definition? Is
Yeah,
there a good one?
it's a little bit wonky. So a land trust is a nonprofit conservation organization whose primary mission is to preserve land and water resources in perpetuity. And we do that primarily through two tools. One is outright acquisition of environmentally sensitive land, or the tool that we use more frequently, at least at Westchester Land Trust, is the acquisition of conservation easements. And if you'd like to get even more jargony, we can talk about what a conservation easement is, but it's a more efficient way for us to accomplish about 90% of the same end goal without having to actually acquire the land.
So let's pretend I'm a person, which I don't have this, maybe 40 acres of land. And my house is on, my house, I don't have any of this, but I have a house and a pool or whatever that maybe is on a couple of acres. But I want to protect the land around that. Now, as an individual person, how would I reach out to you, your organization, to say, how can we work together on this?
Yes. So an individual, as you described, needs to work with a land trust or a municipality in order to effect a conservation easement. The Internal Revenue Service sets very strict regulations as to what type of organization can accept a conservation easement. You cannot donate a conservation easement to your alma mater or to your local hospital or to your local school. It has to go to either a land trust or a municipality. And that hypothetical landowner, yes, if you're interested in conserving your land, and there are various reasons why landowners wish to do that. Either they have a very deep conservation ethic, the land was in their family for generations, they want to see it preserved, They are adjacent to a nature preserve and they want to create a buffer for habitat. Whatever the reason. It could also be a financial incentive, since there are tax incentives to doing this. They would reach out to their local land trust. If it's in Westchester County, we are the regional land trust for Westchester County. And we would work with them to understand what their goals are and to assess the property to see if it's suitable for a conservation easement and if it would meet the requirements of the federal regulations.
And so that would be with the easement. Now you also mentioned earlier if you just wanted to donate land. How does that part work?
So many land trusts, again, being constrained by their fiscal resources, will have a very high hurdle to meet to actually take on more land outright. As you can imagine, if you're a property owner, the costs of upkeep, even if there are no structures on it, you have to insure the property, you have to make sure that trees are safe in case they're going to fall into your neighbor's pool or what have you. There are costs involved. So we need to really raise the bar in terms of assessing the conservation values of a property that we might consider to outright acquire or accept a donation of. Typically speaking, Sandy, lands that we acquire, and we've only acquired 750 acres in our history. We've preserved about 8,500. Only 750 are lands that we actually own. So that gives you a sense of
Do you own it yourself, the land
Yes.
trust, or is that owned with any other partners?
No, the 750 is the acres that we own free and clear ourselves. We don't co-own any lands. Sometimes we acquire lands and then turn them over to the municipality, or in some rare instances to the state. But the 750 is the number that we currently own outright. So for us to actually do that, we have to go through a very, very strict set of guidelines. And typically speaking, and it doesn't have to be 40 acres, by the way. Our smallest project is less than an acre. Believe it or not.
Where's that?
In Yonkers. And some of our other smaller projects are here in the district. Why would we take ownership of a property that's only an acre? If it's strategically located, and what I mean by that is if it's next to a drinking water source, if it's next to an already preserved parcel of land that adding an acre to a 50-acre or 100-acre park or preserve has value, then we would do that. We try to avoid what I call the Swiss cheese approach to land conservation, which is little islands of protected space without any connection.
No connection.
Connections are key. Scientific studies have shown that the most impactful conservation comes through connectedness. And if you look at conservation plans, whether they're local, county, or even at the state, the 2016 New York State Open Space Plan talks about connectedness. And when we prioritize land conservation, that's one of the key characteristics that we're looking for to decide whether we should expend resources on this parcel.
Let's go back to a couple of months ago, the Dominican Sisters, who are in Ossining on Route 9 at Mariondale. There was a wonderful dedication there, and
Yes.
I'm trying to remember how many. It's 34 acres that they
34 acres,
preserved out of
yes.
their 61 acres, and they're along the Hudson River. And how did you work with the Dominican Sisters? How did that
It's a
all work?
lovely story. It really warms my heart to have had developed that relationship with them. The Dominican Sisters reached out to us in 2012 after they were inspired by the Maryknoll Sisters, also in Ossining, who put a conservation easement on about 45 of their acres on their campus. And what the Dominican Sisters wanted to do, because they felt that their mission was to preserve this asset that God had given them for future generations. And they truly have one of the deepest conservation ethics, an ethic that is to preserve land for the public benefit, the public good. So we were touched by that, and we wanted to work with them at a time when they were also assessing the need to rehabilitate the built environment of their campus. As you know, that property is the home to their congregational offices and a retreat center. And they were exploring the avenue of redeveloping, rehabilitating those structures. The challenge that the sisters faced was, can we do both in parallel? Can we do both at the same time, or are they mutually exclusive? The developed portion of their campus occupies about 20 acres, and the 34 or so acres that they identified as where they're willing to forego any future development, we assessed. Over the years, we worked with them through multiple administrations to determine how much flexibility they would need to accomplish both, preserving roughly half and rehabilitating the other half. And in 2018, this summer, we consummated that deal, and it was incredibly inspirational. And here's a great example of conservation in a dense urban community in Westchester County. Ossining is one of the most densely populated municipalities in the county, if not the state. And it's situated in a very fragile stretch of the Hudson River, as you know, the Croton Bay. The Croton Bay is named in local and state conservation plans as highest priority for preservation because of very critical habitat that's found there. Very diverse fish species that then feed very diverse bird life. And we all know through Eagle Fest and the tremendous story of the return of the bald eagle to the Hudson River, how important that whole food shed is. So the preservation of that stretch of the Hudson is key. Being situated between Route 9 and the Hudson River was also a keystone metric that we felt was highly important. Route 9 is one of the most heavily trafficked corridors in Westchester County, as we all know, for those of us who have been stuck in traffic on it. And it's subject to stormwater runoff and all of the pollutants that can run off from traffic. The Mariondale property now in perpetuity will act as a sponge, as a filter for the stormwater that's coming from Route 9 on its way down a ravine that goes through that property into the Hudson River. So it's a critical way to provide a filter, a buffer to that fragile stretch of the Hudson.
It's also, you talked about connecting. It's not the Swiss cheese because it is connected with a park really to the south, but a lot of activity to the north also.
Yes, so Crawbucky, which is village-owned by Ossining, is right next door. And between the Crawbucky Nature Preserve and some additional village-owned open space of about an additional 35 acres, the easement that the sisters put on their property created almost 1 mile of contiguous protected shoreline along the Hudson River, which is really a wonderful achievement for them, and we cannot thank them enough for that.
Right. Well, that is really a great project. So let's talk about, you've been involved with Valeria. I'm just thinking about some of the other areas in my district, which has been developed. When we talk about Valeria, been developed. I don't know whether they've finished all their development.
They haven't, no.
But there is the issue of development versus land preservation. How did you work on the whole Valeria site? And that was probably a number of years ago.
Yeah, that was actually about 10 years ago. And Valeria is the largest conservation easement that Westchester Land Trust has ever done. And for your viewers, that is located in Cortland. And it's a 650-acre conservation easement, which when we use those numbers, most people don't think in those terms in Westchester County, which is so...
What had it been before there was any development? Was it just open space?
It was wooded wetland. It was wooded wetland. So it was critically threatened, though. And one of the achievements that we feel came out of that project was, in addition to a conservation easement on 650 of the acres, development was allowed to begin in a clustered townhome proposal that would keep the development clustered away from the most critically sensitive areas of the property, which included threatened habitat for turtles. So at the same time we did the easement, we did a turtle management plan for the grantor of the easement, the owner of the property, which is a homeowners association now. And the combination of those two, preserving 650 acres and also identifying a threatened species, was really a marker for Westchester Land Trust. And it marked the first time, I believe, that Cortland actually worked with a land trust to mandate that type of partnership. So it was a great win-win for not only the conservation community, but for the homeowners who live there now. So now they know that the 650 acres around them will be forever preserved. Why is that important? It's in the watershed. It again, Hudson River watershed, acts as a filter, a sponge, a buffer for the pollutants that come from development. And I think it's a great example, Sandy, of how conservation and development can coexist. Westchester Land Trust is not an anti-development advocacy organization. We have to work inside the tent with all parties to a transaction, whether it's developers or not. And we do believe there are ways to partner to make sure that whatever development is done is sustainable. Land conservation, like development, there are most appropriate places to place it, and there are inappropriate places to place it. And we're trying to work with, again, all parties to a development to make sure that it's done sustainably.
Well, if we don't do this, I guess we're going to be wall-to-wall buildings and asphalt, which is not good for any of us.
It's not good for any of us.
or the animals. Or
That's right.
Whatever.
That's right.
The plants. Right. So, one of the things you've been working on recently, I think is the Stewart's Farm.
That's right.
You know, which I remember taking my kids to go there and pick apples, and it's great for pumpkins and all those kinds of wonderful things that a farm is. But, you know, it's really hard to be a farm these days. You know, the value of the land that we have.
That's right.
You know, really sometimes precludes farming.
Exactly, especially in Westchester County. So farming as an industry in New York State is declining, but in Westchester County, it's declining precipitously because there's this constant threat. Farmers cannot afford to continue to operate here. There's always the opportunity to sell that property to a developer for, and I hate this phrase, highest and best use, which in Westchester typically means a residential subdivision. So Stewart's Farm was a wonderful example of a collaboration between New York State, Westchester County, the town of Somers, Scenic Hudson, Westchester Land Trust, and Somers Land Trust. I think I got them all in.
You all sat down in a room together?
We all sat down in a room together, which is sometimes hard to do, but it's
Right.
the quintessential example of a public-private partnership where we knew that we could not raise the funding ourselves to acquire the development rights from the Stewart's family. But New York State created, as you know, probably 15 or more years ago, through the Department of Agriculture and Markets, the Farmland Protection Implementation Program. And this is a grant program that is now a biannual program whereby funds are made available on a competitive basis to qualified farm owners who wish to sell their development rights to a land trust. And this project took 10 years to complete. It was one of the most complicated we've ever done, but we were thrilled to have completed it in April. And Stewart's Farm, which is the oldest working farm in Westchester County, dating back to 1828.
With the same family
Same
members?
Same family, 7th generation, I think now 8th. The little ones are 8th generation now. It's a fabulous story, and we're so thrilled that that farm has been preserved for the public.
Right.
It's a you pick Christmas trees, you pick apples, you pick pumpkins, and it's really, really wonderful asset for all of Westchester and beyond.
Right. It's a place to go, and
Absolutely.
it's just wonderful for families and
Absolutely.
young children. So, you've had some other projects dealing with water quality issues, or assuring that we're protecting our water in different ways.
Sure. So, a land trust, as I said, our primary mission is to acquire land and conservation easements. Once we do that, though, we have a permanent, and this is an awesome responsibility, a permanent obligation to steward the land that we own and to monitor the conservation easements that we hold. Land stewardship on our preserved lands is very critical because, as I said, most of our acquired lands are in or around the drinking water system for New York City and Westchester County. A great example is the Hunter Brook Preserve, which is not too far, it's right over the border in Yorktown. And we've had now, I think, 7 years in a row of what we call riparian buffer plantings. What does that mean? The Hunter Brook is a brook. Riparian means along the stream side. So stream beds become eroded, they become invaded by invasive plants, And every year we have a great volunteer cohort who meet with us at Hunter Brook and at many of our other 29 preserves to remove invasive species and to plant
That's a real challenge these days.
And it's
Oh my
getting
goodness.
even more difficult.
Right.
And to plant new native trees. We've planted hundreds of trees in our 30 years, and they are all monitored year in and year out to restore the health to that watershed.
That is a lot of hard work.
It's a
I
lot
would
of hard
assume.
work.
It's easier to get the easement, I think, than to have to
Right.
do all the upkeep.
Right, which is why when we make a promise of forever to our stakeholders, we mean it, and it's an obligation that we take very, very seriously. We're one of the few types of organizations that has to make a commitment for forever. We can't just close the doors and say we're done. We cannot sell our land to anyone. It has no value as anything other than conservation land. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we have the fiscal resources to steward it.
You know, there's one really wonderful piece of land. Well, there are a lot of pieces at Teatown.
Yes.
Teatown is somewhat in my district and somewhat not in my district because it involves so many different towns around it. And there has been a spreading of land there and so on. And I think you've been involved in a number of ways there.
We actually have worked with Teatown for many years. I actually used to be their board chair, full disclosure, and I work with their current administration very, very closely. Kevin Carter, their executive director, is wonderful. We closed on an easement with them last year on a parcel that they took ownership from the Open Space Institute. So we now have an easement with Teatown, and we're working on a project now. Again in Cortland, and it is in the Indian Brook watershed, and it actually contains a tributary of the Indian Brook. So that's the drinking water supply for Ossining Village, Ossining Town, and Briarcliff. So direct water source, and that's a great example of the types of lands that we want to make sure are not developed at all, if we can at all do that.
Right. Sometimes we forget about those brooks and those streams that
right.
just kind of meander around and could end up in our watershed or end up in the Hudson River or wherever they're going. Now, what about communities like, I mean, Peekskill's pretty small and pretty dense. Are there opportunities? You mentioned Yonkers with getting an acre of property. Are there any opportunities in Peekskill for activities?
Yes. So, Sandy, one of the main goals of the organization, and we have to be relevant to everyone that we serve. Our service territory, as you said, is all of Westchester County and the eastern half of Putnam. Westchester is one of the most diverse counties in the country. From a conservation perspective, so ranging from urban to suburban to truly rural. Many of the land trusts that I know as colleagues of mine tend to focus either on being an urban land trust, community gardens, et cetera, or being truly rural, ranch lands, Colorado ranch lands, et cetera. Westchester really runs the gamut. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we are working in all the communities that need our help. Community conservation is a key now for land trusts throughout the country. What does that mean? It means listening to the community stakeholders to understand what they need in terms of conservation, rather than a land trust coming in and saying, this is what we think we'll do for you. So in cities like Peekskill, or Yonkers, or White Plains, or New Rochelle, we meet with the elected officials, with the conservation boards, the planning boards, to get an understanding of what their priorities are. And these parcels that come to the top can be quarter-acre building lots. They can be old parks that were converted to non-park use, and now the community wants to convert them back to what they were historically.
Well, you had a name for that.
De-development.
De-development. Is that what a de-development is?
Or adaptive reuse.
Okay.
So in the urban setting, it could be adaptive reuse. It could be, I don't want to use the word brownfield because not all of these properties are brownfields, but they could have been former vacant building lots. We're working with Yonkers right now to basically adapt an old abandoned building lot into a greenway. And it's adjacent to a greenway trail. So that's a great example of how we work within an urban setting to provide open space recreation opportunities for urban residents.
Right. So just as we conclude, a board, a town board, a city board could meet with you about some projects. They
Absolutely.
could affirmatively do that. Individuals can also do that. And then you reach out and you have to raise some money too for all of this.
We
So
sure do.
how do you do that real quickly?
Well, for specific land acquisition projects, it really is Westchester Land Trust seeking all sources of funding, grant funding from the state level, the county level, local municipalities. Private funders remain our biggest source of funding for our daily operations. We couldn't turn the lights on without our private funding sources. So for those of us in the community who want to make sure that our resources are protected, clean air, clean water, clean food supply, please support your local land trust.
So are there, you have a phone number or email or whatever that people, if they want to volunteer either their money or their time,
Yes.
they can do that?
Yes, so westchesterlandtrust.org, and our phone number is 914-234-6992.
Well, you just provide such an important service to Westchester, and as you said, actually Eastern Putnam, as you go up into a different area. And I know sometimes some of the things that you're working on end up going around the Long Island Sound
Yes.
too,
Yes.
as you go forward.
Yes,
So
exactly.
we thank you so very much
Thank
for
you
being
for having
here, and I hope everybody listened very well and will participate in thinking about where we go in the future to be able to have even more growth in our preservation of our land, which is so important.
Absolutely.
So thank you so very much for
Thank
being
you,
here.
Sandy.
Thank you for watching, and I know that the Westchester Land Trust has been there since 1988, a great organization, and just watch for their activities and enjoy all of the land that they preserve for all of us. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good evening. If you have any questions, give me a call at my office, 914-941-1111. Thanks so very much.